Oops. Okay. Yeah, so welcome here, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We actually have Julia, one of our members, who is going to be presenting today. She's got an MA in counseling psychology, I believe. Yeah, so she's just going to present for us today, and I believe open it up for some questions and some discussion afterwards. So Julia, I will turn it over to you.
Okay. Well, I'm grateful to have this opportunity. I am a member at Rise, and I actually just had my 100th workout right before COVID hit, so I feel pretty pumped about that. It's about the longest I've ever stuck with anything, so something must be working well with Rise and the way they do things, because I do not consider myself a gym rat. So it's amazing I've made it this far, so I'm looking forward to getting started again on Saturday morning, as I'm sure the rest of you are. So like Carrie said, I'm a local counselor. I have a small private practice in Winkler, and I wear a couple hats. My other hat is that I also work at the hospital in the MRI department. I'm an MRI tech. Two very different fields, but in lots of ways they do interact, and it makes me quite interested in brain science, makes me quite interested in psychology, and so lots of the factors play into my interest in mental health. So I was really glad that they asked me to do this, because you may or may not know that this is Mental Health Awareness Month, May, and also Mental Health Week in Morden anyways. I don't know if it is in Winkler. So it's a good time to kind of talk about mental health. And I know that many of us are feeling a little bit better now that we can get out a little bit more and we can have a few small gatherings than we were able to a couple weeks ago. So some of the struggles are lifting a little bit, but I'm sure there's still lots of issues that are coming up these days that are either were there anyways but are feeling a little bit worse, or even new anxieties and stresses that you didn't have before. So my goal here today is to be fairly general as we talk about mental health. If there's some interest, I have a willingness to do some future seminars as well. So if you do have a topic that you're interested in, feel free to say so. I'm going to sort of talk for maybe 15-20 minutes, and then if you want to sort of have a bit of a discussion about different issues, ask a few questions, we can certainly do that at the end. So the one thing I wanted to highlight particularly today is that this is just a massive time of uncertainty, and I don't have to tell you that. We're all experiencing that. But this is really something that we've never faced before, our society has never faced before. So it makes sense that this is tricky, it makes sense that it's complicated, and we don't quite know how to navigate it. So I just want to say that in order to normalize what many of us are experiencing right now. We don't have our normal resources, we don't have our normal people around us, we don't have our normal routines, and so it makes sense that this is difficult. In the psychology world, we really are thinking about this whole experience as a trauma. My definition of trauma, are lots of definitions, some more technical than others, but my definition of a trauma is something that just really suddenly and profoundly changes the way we see the world and our sense of safety in it. So this, I feel like, is a really good lens to look at this whole situation and why we're feeling so unsettled, why there's so much anxiety coming up and that sort of thing. Because at a very basic level, we're suddenly feeling very unsafe in the world. Things like normal going out, things like socializing with family, all those things are now unsafe according to the way that things have been defined for us. So when we experience a trauma, our brain is really confused. It doesn't know how to make sense of what used to be safe and now suddenly feels so unsafe. So one of the things that happens is we get all these emotions that we don't process very well. So anxiety, dread, feelings of hopelessness, helplessness, all those things, profound sadness, grief, those kinds of things all come up. And our capacity to deal with them is not as robust as it normally is. So generally, we can sort of think ourselves through that. We can kind of engage in things that we used to be able to do, and we can calm those anxious and distressing emotions down. But when we're already at a very profound level feeling in a threat state, we can't always access those rational capabilities that we normally have. So that's really common with trauma. And so I think that's a lot of sort of what we're seeing is people that generally would cope pretty well, some now can't access some of those resources that they used to have. So this contributes to that sense of feeling really, really drained, that contributes to that sense of mental sort of fuzziness and confusion, difficulty making decisions, feeling listless and unmotivated, all very normal responses to trauma. And also combined with this sense of feeling really agitated and on edge and sort of wandering around the house trying to figure out how to calm ourselves. It's sort of these two ends of the spectrum that we're dealing with all the time. So one of the things that I want to emphasize tonight is some of the ways that we can calm ourselves down at a body level, reduce the threat that our brains are feeling, and begin to sort of re-engage our rational brain to be able to make sense of things again. So there's four major things that I want to touch on today. One is engaging well with emotions. The second is developing a sense of self-compassion. The third one is the practice of mindfulness. And the fourth one is lowering our expectations for ourselves and our world right now. So those are the big ones that I want to touch on today. Also, I am just going to really briefly talk about, the really obvious things. So really basic self-care are things like, eating well, getting enough sleep, exercising, keeping our caffeine intake down, not relying on substances. Those kinds of things are pretty obvious, and we try to do those as much as we can. It's always more difficult in times of stress, but I do want to emphasize those things are important too. The other thing that is highlighted right now because of the way the Manitoba government has responded to this crisis is, they've offered a mental health program, the CBT ability, CBT or whatever that they've offered to Manitobans. And this can be really good. CBT is a really proven method, but it does involve a lot of brain power in terms of thinking, changing your thinking. And I find anyways, when it comes to trauma and feeling really activated, many people can't always access that part of the brain that does rational thinking. And so sometimes I find that CBT doesn't always help in these kinds of situations. I know some people are finding that program quite helpful, others aren't. So I do recommend, it is a free service that the government is offering right now. I've put the link in the notes. It is worth checking out if you are finding yourself quite anxious or struggling right now. So those are two things I wanted to emphasize, but not really what I wanted to talk about today. So I'm going to go back to those four things: engaging with emotions, developing self-compassion, mindfulness, and lowering our expectations. So we'll start with engaging with emotions well. So the three important concepts that are a part of that are acknowledging emotions, normalizing your emotion, and validating emotion. So we need to normalize our emotion because all these emotions that we're feeling are really normal, really acceptable responses to what we're facing. And so anytime that we're sort of trying to talk ourselves out of emotion, we're generally just going to increase emotion rather than sort of calm it down. There's a phrase that we like to use in counseling called "you got to name it to tame it." And that just is the concept of, if we can put words on an experience, if we can put words on an emotion, usually it helps us gain some mastery over it, helps us gain some sort of sense of being able to cope with it a little bit better. By acknowledging it, by naming it, we can get a little bit of distance from it. It doesn't feel like our whole of our experience. By gaining some distance from an emotion, it makes us a little bit less reactive. For instance, if we can say, yeah, I'm feeling really angry about this situation right now, the simple fact of being able to name it, to acknowledge it to ourselves, makes us less likely to be reactive and to strike out at people or to be really irritable or resentful or whatever. The fact that we can just sort of name it and acknowledge that we're feeling angry can help us figure out a a better way to deal with it. So once we've sort of normalized the emotion and we've validated that it's a normal part of what we're experiencing, then we can kind of choose how we want to deal with it. I like to think about emotions as sort of being energy. And so the problem is when energy gets stuck in our body. So if we have emotion that's being stuck, not being expressed in some form or another, that's when we end up with trouble. So for instance, with anger, we need to get that energy moving through us. So a negative way of handling that would be to sort of bark at someone, be irritable, lash out, be defensive. A more positive way of dealing with that very normal emotion would be to move, to get, to exercise, to run, to sort of go somewhere safe and scream at the sky, or just to get that emotion out of us rather than keeping it sort of trapped inside. Being able to talk about it helps, being able to acknowledge it helps, all those things. We validate our emotions by trying to be really non-judgmental about what we're experiencing. We sometimes have a tendency to tell ourselves, I shouldn't be feeling sad. Some of us are, have had to cancel trips or things that we're really looking forward to. And we feel like we're not entitled to feel sad about that because other people have it worse than us. But generally, sort of trying to talk ourselves out of an emotion like that will generally make it hang on longer. So by validating the fact that this is a sadness for you, this is a grief, you can usually help it to feel a little bit softer and move through a little bit faster. At the end of this handout, I included some resources. One really great one is one about grief. The discomfort that we're feeling right now is grief. It was a really great discussion on that topic. So after you've kind of engaged with emotions that you're feeling by acknowledging, normalizing, and validating them, then we also want to work on self-compassion. Self-compassion is basically just the idea of learning to treat ourselves with kindness. We tend to be so harsh and judgmental towards ourselves sometimes. Self-compassion is just learning to treat ourselves like we would someone that we really cared about. Refusing to judge ourselves for how we're sort of performing in this time, or the fact that we can't get over it, those kinds of things. We want to reduce all that self-talk. Self-compassion also has to do with sort of refusing to do that comparison thing. How am I doing compared to somebody else? To really just be confident in sort of living our life, because we are facing unique challenges. Some people resist self-compassion because it feels like it makes them sort of soft and unmotivated, and that they won't accomplish things. But generally, research has found that true self-compassion is actually the opposite. We'll be motivated far more by kindness than we will by harsh criticism. So if you think about sort of teachers that you grew up with when you were kids, if you had a math teacher that was really kind, comforting, and supportive, you were more likely to try harder to learn than a teacher that was quite critical. So that's what we're trying to harness, a sense of self-compassion, being on our own side. A resource for that I've put in the notes is the work of Kristen Nash. She has a lot of really excellent resources about self-compassion. One of the ones that I thought I would talk through just now as we're talking about is a little bit of our writing exercise. And we can sort of just imagine doing this. You don't need to do it right now, but it's the idea of thinking about somebody that you care about coming to you and telling you that they're struggling. So think about, and if you can, at some point, write down sort of how you would respond to them, what kind of words you would say, what kind of actions you would do, and even what kind of tone of voice you would speak in if you had somebody who you cared about who was telling you about a struggle. Then do the same thing. Think about a time when you were struggling and notice what is the tone of voice you're talking to yourself with. What are the words you're using? What are the things that you're doing? Probably harsher for most of us. And then just notice that discrepancy. Why is it that you would speak so much more kindly and with a much more compassionate tone of voice to somebody else than you would have to yourself? And reflect on the ways, how can I extend a little bit of that grace towards myself? It's a practice, it's a muscle, self-compassion. We do have to do it regularly. We do have to work on it. It doesn't come naturally for a lot of us. So self-compassion, really important. The third thing that I wanted to highlight here today is mindfulness. Mindfulness has a lot of definitions out in literature right now, but my definition of it is sort of just being really present where we are. Especially in times like this when we're all really anxious, we tend to get really caught up in our heads, trying to figure things out, trying to understand, and we kind of forget to be present. So when we're with, even the opportunities we do get to be with other people, whether it's at the store or with our family, or, the time that we bump into somebody on the sidewalk, we're so caught up in our heads that we forget to actually experience what it's like to be with somebody else in this time that we're all feeling so isolated. So mindfulness is just the concept of sort of, I want to be present. I want to be present this moment that I have with this other person. I want to be present and really experience it, because that is really going to help with the isolation. So there's two forms of mindfulness that I think are helpful in this kind of time. One is mindful movement. So for instance, when we get a chance to go back to the gym, or when you're doing virtual workouts at home, or even when you're just sort of out and walking around the block, mindful movement just means just try to be really bodily present. Try not to be thinking about sort of your weight loss goal or your whatever it is, tasks you need to do today. Try to just be really present in what it feels like to exercise in the moment, what it feels like to move, what it feels like to, when we're out in the parking lot exercising, what it feels like to have the air on us and the cold, and it might even be snow this weekend. What does it feel like to just be really bodily present in those moments? Mindful movement also has to do with sort of a helpful thing for recovering from trauma is really repetitive movement. So walking, by definition, can be very soothing because of the repetitive motion of it. Even things like sort of rocking chairs, where you're sort of just going back and forth, just really has a soothing quality to it. So if you're finding yourself anxious or upset in some form or another, those kinds of mindful, repetitive movements can really be helpful. Another type of mindfulness that I think is really helpful in this time is mindful breaks. So we've got mindful movements, and we've got mindful breaks. Mindful breaks would be like, taking a break from the input of information, taking a break from the news, taking a break from the Facebook posts, turning off screens, doing some things that will feel soothing to your soul. Creating something really simple like a deep breathing practice. So there's lots of apps for this. One of the ones that I like is called Breathing Zone. It's a free app, and it just has an icon on it that sort of gets bigger and then gets smaller, and gets bigger and then gets smaller. And you just breathe along with it. You can adjust the pace if it feels too fast or too slow. And it just helps you regulate your breathing. When we get anxious, we get this really shallow breathing that isn't very effective. So if we can slow our breathing down and just really practice that, so even just 2 or 3 minutes a day can really sort of retrain your body how to sort of slow things down, start to relax. So using something like that can be really helpful to take a mindful break. There's a couple others in the notes, things like taking a mini holiday. By that I mean just picturing a place that you really love to be, a vacation or someplace, cabin or something where you really enjoy being, and spend some time just really trying to get a full, robust picture in your head of that place, and then go through the different senses. What kinds of things would you be seeing if you were in those places? What kinds of things would you be hearing? What kinds of things would you smell? What kinds of things would you be tasting? What kinds of things would you be feeling? By just taking even 5 minutes to sort of really bring that image into your mind and be able to sort of really experience it helps a lot with just your body being able to slow down, feel grounded. So that can help. Mindful movement, mindful breaks. And the last thing that I want to talk about in terms of coping and tending to our mental health is to lower our expectations. So in counseling, whenever we talk about trauma or crisis, when people are in crisis, our expectations for their growth and their capability are going to be really small. Really, at this point, their job is to survive whatever it is they're going through. When they get to the other end of that, they start to feel safer. That's when they'll start to process what it means, what has happened. But in the moment, their job is just to survive. So translating that to this trauma that we're all experiencing, try to keep your expectations for your own productivity really low in these days. We see all this stuff on Instagram and Facebook about all these things that people are accomplishing in this time. But I think for most of us, that's quite unrealistic. Focus on what you can control. There's so much right now that we can't control in terms of what the government regulations are put into effect, how many people get sick, all those kinds of things are so out of our control. But what is in our control is sort of what's right in front of us, what's in our house, how we're responding to things, what kind of practices we're putting into our lives to help us cope, the mindful practices, those kinds of things, connecting with our families, all those things are still in our control. Keep any to-do lists or task lists really small and simple. Celebrate small accomplishments, as small as you can make them, really give yourself a chance to be proud of yourself if you do are able to tackle some things that are on a list. For me, one of the things that I really keeps me motivated when I do something like going to the gym, considering that I'm not really a gym person, is I try to remember how hard it was at the very beginning. I remember sort of whatever the intake little exercise that you did with little things. I like the push-ups I had to do. I was so pathetic. I could hardly do them at all. It took me forever. But now after my 100th workout, I can pretty easily do, a number of push-ups. And so I try to always remember that benchmark. I started out and I couldn't do anything. Now I've really grown in my ability. There's still lots of room for me to get better and to grow, but I have made progress. And so I use that example to encourage you to not hold yourself to a high standard, to remember where you came from, how you were feeling, and what you've accomplished today. Don't minimize those accomplishments. Also, focus on your resilience. So it's really easy in this time to see all the ways that we're either not coping or we're feeling so anxious and to be so worried about that. But really, you are a really resourceful person. You're very resilient. And I know that because I'm sure that you've gone through hard things in your life before. And so sometimes it can help sort of remember other things that we thought we wouldn't make it through, or we thought would crush us, or we just weren't sure how we were going to cope with. And by looking at those things and sort of remembering how hard it was, we can sort of remember what were the things that we did that helped us get through it. Maybe there were practices, maybe there were affirmations that we used to use and we've sort of forgotten those things. Maybe there were people that we connected with at the time, and there might be people in this time that could help you in a similar way. So try to look back and remember your resilience from previously. Also, we can look back and remember that in those times that were really, really difficult, we thought we weren't going to make them through. Now we look back and the intensity is gone. We sort of realize we did make it through. At some point, this will be over. We'll be looking back on it from the other side, and we'll sort of have that sense of perspective, or we did get through it. And we can notice the things that helped. So we will get there. And if you can sort of have faith a little bit that that you've done it before and you can do it again. That can help with your mental health. So those were the 4 things that I really wanted to focus on tonight. Additionally, because of the work that I do, I always just also have to remind people that if this time is overwhelming, if you're really struggling, there are resources out there. Be sure that you're accessing mental health resources, either through your doctor, through crisis lines, through counselors that are around. There are lots of resources in our communities to help, especially right now. So there are things you can do. We want to help with that sense of helplessness. We want to focus on calming the body so we can re-engage our rational minds. And that's the focus of what I wanted to talk about today. So I'm curious if anybody has any comments about what I'm talking about. I know I went through that quite quickly. Any comments, any questions, things that I know this is kind of vulnerable to say, things that you've been struggling with, but perhaps there are things that you want to bring up, or wins. You know, we talk a lot at the gym about non-scale victories, so this could be something too. What have you noticed that has been helping you in this time? It could very likely help other people. So I'll just give some time for anyone to make any comments or ask any questions. Just going to scroll through and see. I know there's some other people here that I didn't see at the beginning. Anyone have any comments about what's helping them engage in their physical activity practice, considering that we all are members at the gym here now? What is helping to be able to connect with that? How is that helping your mental health right now?
Don't everyone all talk at once. I can jump in there. Even as a coach, I'm someone who definitely started, just change this here. Yeah, even as a coach, I'm someone who started as a member. I was a member for 3 years before I ever started coaching. And I personally find it pretty hard not to be doing it with someone. So just finding that accountability partner, whether it's someone that, you know, now that the rules are loosening up a little bit, or the guidelines, whether it's joining them, right? Having them come with you to the outdoor workouts, or just even connecting, letting them know that, hey, I'm going to go to the virtual one at this time, right? Because you can still talk and stuff through that. But I definitely rely on some other people for accountability. I found that it's a struggle for me to be in my house and then find the motivation to do it on my own without having those other people around. Because even as a coach, even if I was doing it, I was usually doing it at a time when there was lots of other people in the gym to just kind of feed off of that energy, off of that community. So yeah, I found just having people around to still support you, encourage you, and then just kind of remind you too, right? This is something that we should be doing. And yeah, like I said, that's coming from me as a coach. I've struggled as well, not having access to that direct access to our community.
Yeah, very true. I've experienced the same thing. And it's interesting how just the fact that the outdoor workouts have come back up, suddenly I feel motivated again to work out, to go to the gym, to meet workout buddy Paula there. And we are, you know, suddenly it just feels so much more easy to do. One thing that I've noticed in myself, even though I haven't been able to do a great job of keeping up with working out, is I really have gained a lot of encouragement from the Rise staff, actually, just because it's really obvious how much you care about the members and how hard you're working to try to connect with the members. And for me, even though I haven't engaged a whole lot, it's encouraging to me. It lets me know that there's somebody out who's cheering me on. I found that helpful. So I'm sure other people would probably be able to agree with that as well.
I have a question.
Sure.
Julia, this is George, also a Rise member. I guess only Rise members on this call, maybe not. But what advice do you have for when somebody gets snappy? So I guess the root cause of the snappiness, we've kind of figured it out. I have a smoke allergy, so if I'm around smokers, then usually the next day, whatever toxins in the cigarettes, I'll get really snappy. But
sometimes the same day.
But no, it's usually the next day, but maybe it's the same day, like Helen's saying. But anyway, like obviously stressed out about everything and being cooped up and things like that. The smoke is still the underlying thing, so it's a chemical reaction, we think. But then the stress of the day and snapping at coworkers or trying hard not to. But what's your best advice for that? Like right in the middle of the day.
Yeah. So again, I would go back to self-compassion for something like that. There's a lot of factors, right? There is a physical reaction that's happening within you in terms of the smoke, right? That just makes it difficult. There's also sort of this unsettledness in all of us right now that makes it difficult for us to have the patience and all of that we might have had in the past. And so we're more quickly reactive. So the way I would handle that myself would be to notice what it is that's happening. You know, I know that I'm probably feeling frustrated because both the smoke, but also, you know, I'm just noticing this irritation within myself. And by noticing that, we can kind of find a better way to deal with it. So perhaps I need to be more assertive and just, you know, say I need to get away for a little bit, have some better boundaries, find some ways of sort of decompressing, to be able to talk about it without sort of a blamey vibe, that sort of thing. If we can sort of just acknowledge that it's a difficult thing for us, have some self-compassion for ourselves, usually we can find the resilience to deal with it in a better way than snapping at people. I know that's sort of not a formula, easier said than done. Does that help at all?
It does, yeah, I guess. Like what you said about having more self-compassion, or actually like whatever. I know what you mean by that. So I guess not being so hard on yourself, and it's not your fault or whatever. So that's helpful.
Self-compassion for yourself, you know, also self-compassion for other people. Perhaps people are smoking more these days because they're trying to cope. You know, those kinds of things can be possible too. So yeah, it's tricky. Yeah. And it takes practice, right, to be able to sort of deal with things without getting snappy. We can still have the same conversation, but it would come across better if we can be less reactive and less defensive or frustrated about it.
Thanks.
Any other questions, comments? I know this is a vulnerable topic. It can be tricky to feel like you can articulate yourself in a safe way, but
I have a question.
sure. Who's talking? Tyson? Okay.
It's Tyson. Yeah. When I was going through my precision nutrition classes, one of the sections was kind of like mind training yourself in a way that you would basically, as vividly as you could, envision a situation where you normally would like struggle through, and they said that as the more vivid that you could put yourself through it in your mind, that your mind actually can't tell the difference really if it's real or not. Is that something true?
Yeah, research shows that your mind can't really tell the difference between something that you're imagining and something that you're actually experiencing. So that's one of the reasons that little mini vacation exercise helps a lot. Yeah, because if you can sort of just really put yourself there, imagine it, you really do get the benefits of relaxation that you would get if you were there. So I imagine it would work very similar, probably similar to athletes that, you know, rehearse in their minds a lot too before they do whatever it is they're going to do, right? It's that body memory that they're trying to access. Yeah. To me, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Cool. That's neat how that can work, how your mind is that strong.
Yeah, for sure. Any other comments? Any other topics you would like to see in the future if we were ever to do a call like this again in terms of mental health related?
How about stuff like identifying, well, I guess you can't really diagnose people, but like if you notice something about someone, like your kids or relatives or something like that, or like how to detect early signs of mental illness or not necessarily illness, but like mental health concerns.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's an important one, right? Because sometimes people aren't always super overt about what they're going through. I can give you my initial thoughts, and we certainly could create something about that at some point. But my initial thoughts are people who start to behave differently. If generally they're fairly outgoing or engaging with you, and suddenly they're withdrawing more, or generally they would be out attending certain social events or sporting events, and suddenly they're not. Any kind of change in behavior is important to notice, and then to address it directly, to ask them directly, I noticed that you're not engaging the way you normally would. Is there something going on? Research shows that to ask people directly, we talk about this a lot sort of in suicide prevention, to ask people directly, people fear that that's going to put the thought in their mind, but really asking directly, it gives people the permission to say, yes, that is what I'm thinking. I do want help with it. It can help get help sooner. So to ask directly is important. Sort of, and the opposite would be not only isolation, but if people are all of a sudden, overly engaging, they say some severe mental health problems, like suicidal thinking, people will all of a sudden be really happy when they weren't before, and it's sort of a cue that all of a sudden they've sort of made up their mind about something. So any kind of like sudden changes in behavior are important to notice, and withdrawal especially, when we're looking beyond suicidal behavior, any kind of withdrawal from what they would normally do or changes is important to notice.
Carol here. Thanks, Julia, for all those points that you listed there. Of all those 4, there was something very applicable that I could really pull out of each one. So thank you. That's been really awesome, especially when you were talking about the self-compassion, I guess, and even just talking or thinking about myself as a coach right now. But I'm still one of you guys, right? So I've been dealing with a lot of the same emotions or the same decisions that everyone else is. And yet I find myself not being nearly as kind to myself as I would be to any of you. If any of you had come to me with the same things that I've been going through, guaranteed I wouldn't have talked to you the same way I'm talking to myself. So that was a really, really good eye opener for me. Thanks for mentioning that. And just as far as future topics, one that I would find interesting to hear more about or learn more about, I guess, is the whole idea of self-sabotage. When you know the right thing to do, but you don't do it, or you're making progress and then you sabotage your own results by your own doing. So that'd be something interesting in the future to talk about as well. But thank you for today.
That would be interesting, yeah. And just to normalize that a little bit, I mean, self-compassion is hard, and I've studied this for 4 years, and I've practiced it and talked to people about it for years, but it's still a struggle for me as well. I mean, it is just so easy to be compassionate to other people and not to ourselves. So that's really, really normal. Yeah. But again, a muscle and a skill that can be developed. And those of us who care for other people can tend to feel like self-care is the last of our priorities because we fill our cup by caring for everybody else. And so sometimes we have to make an intentional effort to do it the other way around and to care for ourselves first. Yeah. Great. Well, it feels like that's sort of all that's on the tip of people's tongues at the moment. And so, you know, if you do happen to have a particular questions that you didn't feel comfortable asking her today, my email is on that handout, and you can feel free to reach out to me, and I will do what I can to help you get the information that you need.
Julia, do you mind, just because I do have this, seeing as we had emailed previously, I'll also just kind of read the list here of some topics that you gave, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah. Those were just really quick brainstorming topics. So
yeah, no, but one that's on here, honestly, that I wouldn't have necessarily thought to ask for, but it was interesting that you gave it, was like taming conflicting emotions, right? So that would actually be something that I wouldn't have necessarily thought as a topic of interest, but kind of like what Carol said, the self-sabotage, but then also those conflicting emotions. That's one that would definitely, I think, be of some interest probably for some others as well.
Sure.
So just a quick kind of general list, and if anyone kind of has any, you know, interest piqued by any of these. So just kind of, yeah, anxiety, coping with uncertainty and change, self-compassion, we kind of mentioned a little bit there. In the time of COVID, and I'm assuming that would probably be applicable to other times as well.
Sure.
Adding psychological flexibility to your workout. Mindfulness, your mental health superpower. And then taming conflicting emotions, and then also grieving the small and large losses we are facing every day. So if there's any of those topics as well that anyone kind of, you know, piqued their interest or something that we'd like to hear more on, yeah, like Julia said at the start there, she is willing to do some additional kind of even helping us highlight mental health for the month of May. Yeah. If there's anything else.
I'll just give a little bit of clarification. The one sometimes it confuses people, the idea of psychological flexibility. For me, that's a really important concept. You know, when we talk about changing thoughts, we're often talking about, you know, this is my sort of default thought. I always think this negative thought, and now I want to replace it with something else, which can be helpful. But psychological flexibility is a little bit more about just sort of how do I tolerate the difficult thoughts that I have, not necessarily changing them, but how can I think more broadly, just be more flexible in the way that I think, that I'm not fused to certain thoughts. It's kind of a different concept, but it is a really helpful one. I think it also ties into sort of what Carol was talking about, the self-sabotage, because we sort of say one thing and we do something else, and it can have to do with our thoughts, and it can have to do with sort of conflicting motivations as well, right? So. Good. Well, I appreciate the feedback that we did get today, and all the attendance, people that thought that mental health was important enough to sit and listen to this evening. I'm grateful for that. It's a passion of mine. And I know that no matter where we're at, we can always improve our own mental health, and we can always strive to be a little bit more flexible in the way that we engage with life. So I'm glad that so many people were interested in hearing about the topic, and yeah, we'll work on developing something else for future if that works.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Julia, for taking the time to do this session with us today. It's really appreciated, and have a great rest of your week, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Julia.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.